Welcome to Early School Success, strategies for donors to support young children in recovering learning and accelerating gains. I'm Kelly Andrews from the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, our hearts are heavy after the gun violence in Uvalde, Texas, that killed 21 people, including 19 elementary school children and 2 teachers. Thank you for your commitment to ensuring that all children have an opportunity to learn, grow, and reach their full potential. Today, Kat Rosqueta, the founding executive director of CHIP and adjunct faculty at Penn School of Social Policy and Practice, will discuss the strategies in the Early School Success Primer. Kat is also a board chair of Candid, the merger of GuideStar and Foundation Center, and a member of the board of Greenlight Fund. Then, Kat will be joined in conversation with 3 distinguished panelists. Ralph Smith, managing director for Campaign for Grade Level Reading, our partner on the Early School Success Primer. Ralph calls himself a recovering law professor, formerly at Penn Law. He's also a former senior vice president of Annie E. Casey Foundation. Rashanda Perryman, program manager in community stewardship for Vanguard, where she co-leads the Strong Start for Kids grant-making portfolio. Rashanda has previously worked at the William Penn Foundation, Children's Defense Fund, and as a teacher and caseworker. Speirn, interim CEO and president of Maine Community Foundation, is former president and CEO of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the Peninsula Community Foundation. After our panel, we will open up the webinar for audience questions, so please enter your questions in chat or using the Q&A function on Zoom. Now, here's Kat Rosqueta.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you for introducing us, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. What I want to start out doing, and to frame the conversation that I'm going to get to facilitate with Ralph and Sterling and Rashanda, is just give you a high-level view of what is in the primer that Kelly referenced, which is available for free from our website as part of a whole donor toolkit. For those of you who are here because you're trying to understand how you can recover learning loss and advance gains. And in that primer, we identify 3 evidence-based strategies that can help all kids thrive. The first is to support the whole child. Children cannot recover learning loss or advance gains unless they are emotionally, mentally, and physically secure. Right? That whole child view is part of what every person needs in order to build the school and life skills that are linked to life success. Examples of that include things like adopting a multi-generational approach, because as the young children are that we're talking about in the primer, they are reliant on the adults in their lives to ensure that security, right? Their parents and other adult caregivers and all of those who are in charge of making sure that they have a strong start in life. The next evidence-based strategy that we discuss is to expand learning opportunities. That was especially brought home really clearly when all the congregate care settings had to close due to COVID, when schools had to close due to COVID. So what we often think of as the traditional sites and times of learning were no longer available to our youngest children, and still today in some cases. So the idea is to expand where and when learning takes place. This can include things like investing in high quality childcare and reinforcing that learning happens everywhere and all the time. And in our discussion later today, you're going to hear of some of the really innovative ways that people have addressed that. It also includes growing the pool of teaching talent and rethinking who our teachers are. And last but not least, and this is actually a strategy that in some ways reinforces the other two strategies, is to ensure digital equity. Again, this was an issue that was brought home really starkly during COVID. Although it's been an issue, the disparity in digital access and device access has long been known. But what does that mean? That means not only increasing student access to devices and broadband, it means in a way that you're supporting the whole child and their families, increasing their families' access, supporting digital literacy with training and ed tech to all those adult caregivers I mentioned earlier. So it's not just about the children and the connectivity, it's about the literacy, digital literacy and devices for all of those who are trying to help these children succeed. So that's a high level view about what's in the primer. Like I said, this is a free resource that we are making available to individual donors and institutional grant makers around the world who care about this topic. But what I'd like to do now is welcome our panelists, because all of them in the different roles that Kelly introduced them with are in some way working to implement these strategies and are in a position to talk about some of the great innovations that have happened during what has been an extraordinarily difficult time for these young people and their families. So hopefully you see the fellow panelists that I get to facilitate a conversation with. Ralph, Rashanda, Sterling, welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm going to start with Ralph, and actually, though I get the privilege of starting the conversation, I want to make sure all of you know that we would love you to join in this conversation. So even though it is set up as a webinar, just because of the numbers, there is at the bottom of your screen on Zoom a Q&A function. I will be looking at that throughout the webinar. When I see a question that comes up that I feel like is really relevant to where the discussion is, I will grab it and pose it. But I will also make sure that towards the end of our time together, there is an open Q&A session for anything that you'd like to discuss that hasn't yet come up. But let's get started. So my first question is to Ralph. And Ralph, I know, because we've been colleagues now for a while, that your focus on early learning and early school success has it's been your work for decades, as Kelly said, first at the Annie Casey Foundation and now as leading the campaign for grade level reading. So given that perspective, tell us some of what you've seen and maybe what has changed.
Well, Kat, let me begin by acknowledging you and your colleagues at the Center for High Impact Philanthropy. Miriam, who leads our philanthropy work at, that's Miriam Shark, at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, can hardly stop talking about the relationship we've developed, especially over the past year or so, around this particular project. And we're really pleased to have an opportunity to get this donor toolkit into the hands of our community foundation colleagues, our United Way colleagues, our colleagues in family foundations, and those philanthropy-minded families and individuals who support campaigns in 350 communities across the country. We're excited about that. We've appreciated the relationship and the work, and we want to begin by just thanking you for getting the product. Thank you so much. Now, with respect to your question, let me offer this observation. As we approach this phase, and I would love to say the end of the pandemic or the post-pandemic period, we find many more children stranded on the wrong side of an even larger opportunity and achievement gap. That means that a crisis is rapidly metastasizing into a catastrophe. a catastrophe which will require smart decisions around the public resources that are being allocated to early school success and equitable learning recovery. And equitable learning recovery must be regarded by us all as an urgent priority. But these smart decisions and by public sector decision makers really can be augmented and supported and supplemented with private resources and private decisions, building on what we see as some opportunities presented by bright spots and silver linings. And that may seem overly optimistic, but let me cite three possibilities. You mentioned one, that millions of children who had no access to any education at all when schools closed and went online helped to crystallize the digital divide challenge that we have been concerned about for decades. And today, assuring digital equity has become not only a topic of a conversation on the policy screen, but it has become a national priority. And there are lots of opportunities for private investment. Secondly, as we realize that providing laptops and hotspots had to come only after we provided meals for students, many of us were now willing to acknowledge that we have multiple expectations of what we call schools. And some of those expectations are different from, conflict with, and maybe have priority over at any moment teaching and learning. And that suggests that we ought to rethink what we expect of school and include teaching and learning as a much broader responsibility. And your point about learning happens everywhere is one that the campaign has embraced completely. And the third area for some private investment is the area of parents. This exodus, this reverse exodus back to homes and families and parents has underscored the need to move from what we have been seeing as an evolving, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes well, family engagement effort to more robust strategies to equip and support parents to become and be effective in their role as essential partners in good things happening for their kids, academic, socially, and otherwise. So let me put those three on the table and really yield the time back to you and my colleagues, because I really want to hear your questions and their answers as well.
All right, excellent. Thanks for starting us off. So urgency of addressing digital equity, rethinking the multitasking institution that we've relied on schools to be. And then the third, parents as partners. Okay, great frame to start. I'm going to turn it to Sterling now. So supporting the whole child, as Ralph already alluded to, means supporting their parents, their families. Can you talk about what does that look like?
Thank you, Kat, and it's just great to be here with Ralph and Rashanda and Kelly and you today. When as you set it up in the beginning, the whole child means the whole family, and that does mean not just two generation, but multi-generational strategies in the home. Ralph put a good light on the school, and of course, the home is such an essential player in this pursuit of whole child development. We've come to understand the social determinants of health recently, and that the healthcare system is a part of that, but it's not the only part of that. And I think we should also think about the social determinants of education, because what happens in the home and with the family influences powerfully a child's arc of success, before school, during school. And I think what's exciting is more and more investors, funders, philanthropists, and governments are coming to appreciate that financial insecurity is one of the biggest contributors to stress in families in their home. We worry a lot about adverse childhood experiences or adverse community experiences, but the revolution in thinking about getting more financial resources to working families, especially when their children are young, I think is going to do a tremendous amount about supporting families, supporting the education of their young children. So the child care tax credit, which we understood reduced childhood poverty by 40% during its short-lived reign. But the arguments for the child tax credit were powerful and strong. Now we have local governments looking at baby bonds. I'm here in the District of Columbia. Our city council has created baby bonds for every child born in the district that's on Medicaid or living with 300% of poverty. Direct cash assistance to working families. We've seen amazing changes in family behaviors when we just address poverty by addressing the lack of financial resources. So it's exciting to look at child savings accounts, which the campaign has had several really great, along with Chip, webinars on child savings accounts. So anything that can put more resources in the present, pocketbooks of our families, but also a future orientation for a more positive future. So those are some of the things that are happening, all impact early school and early childhood success, but may be coming from funders that are focusing on poverty as their starting point rather than education.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think a lot of times, like every sector, we can operate in silos and not appreciate the fact that actually, if you are successful in bringing more financial security, whether you may have identified yourself or not, you are investing in early school success for the families that you're bringing more financial security to. One follow-up question, because I don't know if everybody is familiar with something that you said, baby bonds and children's savings account. Can you just explain what that is exactly?
Well, the children's savings accounts were essentially 529 college accounts for all kids, especially those kids whose parents cannot afford to save in a robust manner that maybe a middle-class parent can. The data on child savings accounts is really incredibly exciting. The fact that a newborn child or their parent have a child savings account, in Maine, thanks to the Alfond Foundation, every baby born in the state of Maine gets a child savings account at birth. And that increases the likelihood of that child going to college by 4 to 6 times. Just the fact that there is some money already set aside for college education. And those accounts can grow. Baby bonds is essentially a similar approach, which says we will invest in a child every year, and when they turn age 18, they'll have access to those resources for future education. And these have all come out of the asset building strategies, I think, that Michael Sherrodden in his groundbreaking book, Assets for the Poor, where he said, in a capitalistic system, people rise out of poverty because they build assets, their own education, their home ownership, their business. And that's the strategies, I think, that are really taking hold now in baby bonds and child savings accounts.
Okay, fantastic. And what we'll do is, as some of our panelists mentioned, some of these great resources and thinkers and guidance, we will include some of them in the follow-up to this webinar, so that in addition to some of the resources that are on the toolkit. I want to turn now to Rashanda, because one of the evidence-based strategies for funders is expanding learning. Where it happens, when it happens, how it happens. What does that mean for you?
Thank you, Kat. And I'm just excited to be here, and to Sterling and Ralph. It is a pleasure to hear you all talk about the work that you all have, I know, have been so invested in as a funder. First, I have to say that so I've been in the funding space for 9 years now, and all of it has been based on sort of my roots as a pre-K teacher and watching children learn and how they learn. And the science tells us this, but I got to see with my own eyes that children sort of learn across their domains of development, right? So at the same time that they're learning to walk, they're learning to their brains are processing and building. They're learning to connect with one another and raise their hand in order to talk to their teacher and line up in a line. So all of that, those domains are just activated constantly at the same time. So when I think about expanding learning opportunities for young children, I can't help but think about how we might do that in ways that are different. And the fact that as funders, we are in these really unique positions to meet needs in very different ways. So I really challenge myself to think about how I might operationalize joy as a means to building social and emotional learning for young children in this moment, given all that's happening, right? Like coming out of the pandemic, these days of sort of racial reckoning that's new for children, and certainly everything that we know about gun violence and how it's showing up for young children. All those things are sort of operating within this ecosystem for young children at the same time. So I've really been thinking about, like, what does joy mean and how does it connect to learning? And it's interesting what I found based on what I already really knew is that particularly for young children, things like play, which I would consider as the vessel for joy, for lack of a better term, play is actually not a nice to have. It is a necessity. I mean, have you ever actually watched, or even if you remember, children deeply engaged in play and all of the negotiating, the thinking, the planning, the processing, all of that's happening, all that's cognitive. And then think about the physical aspects of what's happening in that moment. If you're running out on a playground, you're using all of those things. We want children to be active and up and using those gross motor and those fine motor. And then let's think about the innate social and emotional things that are happening with young children in play. So when I think about how we can expand learning opportunities, I connect it to joy. And then I think about how can I as a funder make sure that there are more opportunities for young children to play, to really invest, and how can we create these situations that are playful? Research tells us that play does all this super important stuff. They help teach all those soft skills that are necessary for success in school and life, those problem solving, that planning, that exploration, that decision making. It's fostering all that resilience to hardship. All these psychosocial and social emotional benefits come out of play. And it's really mitigating all those, when we think about early childhood, buffering that hardship, buffering that trauma that might be happening. So in my mind, it's really a key and a useful tool that we can think about. And how can we as funders create opportunities for that kind of meaningful play? And for young children, it might mean, right, supporting building our community design play equipment. It might mean more digital opportunities. For older kids, it certainly might mean those things. But I think we can think about where are these opportunities to open up children's, what they do well, what they do naturally, and make sure that learning is happening as a part of it.
So play as a vessel for joy, which is necessary for early learning, early learning as the foundation for life success, right? You sort of made all those links for us. I wonder if you could share any examples of how nonprofit organizations and funders are taking that logic and turning it into something that is supporting the kind of joy and play, and maybe any that were specific, during these past 18 months, 2 years of the pandemic.
Yeah, so I love that question because I've been looking at a lot of these organizations. So we have like historical organizations like a Kaboom, right? And how Kaboom is using a racial justice lens to ensure that community is engaged in how they might build out play spaces in those communities where we know, who knew? Well, yes, we do know this. We know that there's deficits in communities all across the country. And particularly
Kaboom is a nonprofit.
Yes, Kaboom is a nonprofit organization that builds out play space outdoor play spaces for young children. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that, but they're a really great example of how we can create opportunity for meaningful learning in communities that use actual community voice to design it. So imagine a place like Philadelphia where we know children want to play, but when you are subject to, when you might be scared to go outside, your parents might be scared to take you outside, then where do you put play space? So the right people to ask about that is who? It's community. So organizations like a Kaboom has done a really good job of designing models that create what play space looks and feels like and where they should go by asking the right people. And those are community members, they're young children, they're the nonprofits that are in the community, and then making it really easy for us as funders to actually fund those things. I love some shovel ready. I know as funders, we love good shovel ready projects that have the data behind them, that have the people engaged in them, and that are making the right linkages. Play is great. Play is great. Meaningful play is greater. Play that's designed for learning is even greater. And that's what organizations like Kaboom does.
Yeah. So I don't know if we lost Sterling. So I'm gonna, hopefully he'll be able to sign back in. Here we go. Both Ralph at the beginning and then just now, Rashanda talked about digital equity and Rashanda in the context of particularly for older children. So what about digital equity? You know, Ralph's like, there's an urgency to address. Have we seen any great examples over the past 18 months, 2 years of ways that we're better addressing the need for digital equity? And I'll open that up to anyone.
Kat, if I may, I always get excited when I listen to Rashanda talk, and she opens up a door. But let me tell you what Rashanda did not say.
Oh, okay.
And it's a really exciting project by Vanguard. And I am learning so much because what Rashanda has encouraged in 3 Vanguard communities is an exploration of how to build and reinforce parent agency. Help parent with a guide by the side to make good decisions, to feel a sense of efficacy about making good decisions, and to engage the local amenity and cultural institutions, the museums, the libraries, the zoos, and the like, in meeting those parents where they are and allowing them to have a fuller range of educational to be able to choose among a fuller range of educational opportunities for their children. And that I am learning is a powerful and underinvested strategy. And I know Rashanda's and Vanguard are doing it as a pilot, but what we are seeing so far in that pilot is exciting and is opening up some new doors. And so this energy that Rashanda brings to playful learning and the like, I think is also going to be some energy that we're going to see her bring it to this area of agency in the months and years to come, because the work is really informative and insightful. So Rashanda, keep going. This is really, really, really good stuff. I look forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you. You've been such a great partner with that. And I think it's all connected, right? We can't underline enough that these joyful experiences that children have, they mitigate and they buffer the trauma that so many young children who are living in marginalized, stressful communities. That parent connection, that parent agency, taking your child to a baseball game or the local park, the local museum. We have research and science that tells us that that connection is the mitigating factor between being able to engage in that classroom later on and not being able to. And I think as funders, we have this opportunity to look at all of this ecosystem that isn't that direct learning, but it's all of the pieces that surround that learning. And one of it is this parent agency, these joyful experiences. So thank you, Ralph. You all are doing a super job on it. And it's exciting to see that work really open up.
You know, it's interesting as both of you are talking, and I'm glad you introduced this, Ralph, because I feel like it speaks to two things you said early on, right? Which is you complimented Rashanda, her colleagues at Vanguard, for working with parents as partners, and then working with all these community institutions, which is sort of thinking of learning happening outside of the school, which it necessarily does, whether or not we designed it that way in our heads or not. The other thing, though, that Rashanda, you just said is, I almost feel like we should be, you emphasize connections. And, you know, a term that some of our colleagues use is relational health, right? So you have emotional health, mental health, physical health, and this notion of relational health, meaning that you have those positive relationships with others. And, you know, bad stuff is happening, as we know all too well. But when you have those, when you have high relational health, that, as you said, is a buffer. It's almost protective, right? You can't prevent everything, but it can help protect against some of the bad things that we know too many families have been experiencing. So thank you for that. I want to get back to my question, just because I want to understand the relationship between, we've got the connection between people, and then we've got these devices and technology, which I think were supposed to help with that connection, but some people had more or less, and some families had more or less access to that. So yeah, maybe in the context of the conversation Ralph just started, can you speak to what you're seeing, what you're hoping for, what you wish would happen to advance digital equity?
Well, I'll take a crack at starting that. What we're seeing, and we've got to acknowledge that the federal government and state governments across the country are responding well and rapidly to the digital equity challenge, but they've still got a long way to go. And what we're also seeing that is really encouraging is the creativity and willingness of private investors and private donors to step up. And we're seeing that happen in big cities like Chicago and Los Angeles and Philadelphia and New York. And we're seeing it happen in rural counties in Iowa and Kentucky and Tennessee. We're seeing donors find ways to fill the gap and to put in some temporary solutions for the next several years to give the public dollars an opportunity to come online and do the work. We've seen the creation of learning hubs in San Francisco with the recreation department, in Oakland, a community-driven, powerful parent-led effort. We're seeing it happen, digital equity, digital access for all in Suncoast, Florida, led by the Patterson Foundation. We are seeing across the country local community-driven, well-customized efforts to fill the gap. And that movement is perhaps the most optimistic result of the pandemic. And we want to encourage that movement. We want to encourage a lot of private investment, but we have to see the long-term solution to that as a significant, coordinated, well-executed public investment, and the affordable connectivity effort by the administration, which is being led by the FCC. We have to give them a shout out for making a great start to get families connected and in building relationship with the carriers and providers. And I want to emphasize, great start. There's a lot of work to do, but in the meantime, a lot of private opportunity to invest, to invent, and to show the way forward.
Great. Sterling, anything to add on this point on digital
Yes.
equity?
Yeah, just a great local example, what Ralph is talking about. In the great state of Maine, our 1.4 million people are spread out across the landmass that is equal to all other states in New England. That's New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. So the foundation actually put a big emphasis on broadband access before COVID hit. And I think the historical parallels to the electrification of the United States, way back to the Tennessee Valley Authority, when people didn't have electricity in rural America. And I now think that broadband is now seen as a public good, and that the public sector, as Ralph has said, at the federal and state level, our state in Maine has just taken a very ambitious approach, which is we're going to go the last mile, the last 10 miles into every rural home. And now broadband access is not a nice to have. To Rashanda's point, it's like access to play. You have to have access to the digital world for learning. And I think we're going to see that. We're going to see that. And I think it's accelerated greatly because of COVID.
Right. So rethinking what is a necessary condition to recover those losses and advance these gains. So the Q&A, by the way, I don't know, is just lighting up. So I'm going to dig right into some of the questions that have come through. So one is, are there funding initiatives to educate and counsel co-parents, divorced parents, single parents? This gets to Ralph's, like, parents as partners, on how to mitigate some of the consequences of their challenges. The dynamics of a dysfunctional family traditionally impart negative impacts on children's appetite for learning, right? And which is something that all of you have alluded to in your comments. So any examples that speak specifically to educating and counseling co-parents, divorced parents, single parents on how to mitigate some of the consequences of their challenges?
So I don't know any specific examples that call out those buckets, but I would just highlight for funders around home visiting programs. We have so much data now around those early childhood, to your point, around early relational health. And some of these great home visiting programs like Parent Child Plus, Nurse Family Partnerships, Parents as Teachers, they really are going into homes and working directly with families around some of the embedded issues that come up as a result of co-parenting. They are agnostic about which parent that might be, right? And what that situation looks like. So in some of the scenarios, you see parenting happening where the in-home parent is there and the other parent is coming into the home for the learning. And those practitioners who are going into that home really are encouraging, right? Like, how can we work together as parents? I don't know that it's sort of set up to really think about parenting in the buckets, right? Whether you're a divorced parent or a co-parent, but there certainly is this sort of knowledge of how do I bring information into a home, and often they're practitioners from community who's trying to do that.
Yeah.
You know, given the large number of single and proportion of single parents, we've got to acknowledge and applaud the programs which have made a great effort to make sure that fathers are on the screen and are supported to be productive forces in the lives of their children. And there are many of those programs that are doing quite well. But as importantly, there really is a growing effort to meet parents where they are and to transform informal places and spaces into opportunities for learning, into learning-rich environments. And one particular effort worthy of many shout outs is the relationship between the Laundry Cares Foundation, which is the foundation of the Coin Laundry Association, and the relationship they've had with Too Small to Fail of the Clinton Foundation. we now see hundreds and growing to thousands of laundries across the country, which are creating book nooks and opportunities for children to read and learn while their parents are doing the laundry, converting laundry time to learning time. And we're seeing waiting rooms becoming a learning rich environment. And you mentioned earlier, and Rashanda mentioned earlier, the work of Kaboom and a whole series of partners to turn sidewalks and playgrounds and walls into learning. So what we're seeing is not necessarily a segmentation of the population, but an immersion, a surround sound approach, which is regardless of the size and economic status of your family. Mm-hmm. Wherever you go with kids, parents and kids, or caregivers and kids congregate, we should all have an interest and a commitment into making those places and spaces learning rich environment. And that is a growing and exciting movement across the country.
Mm-hmm. That's the Laundry Care Association, just such a great and concrete example of learning happens everywhere all the time, if you think of it that way. I actually want to pick up on something that you said about these reading nooks, because I know in our prep session, Sterling, you talked about one of these bright spots that you've been involved in related to reading and giving kids access to books that actually, if I remember, predated COVID, the summer reading adventure, but actually COVID just reinforced how important that program was. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it made me think of hearing Ralph, when Raising a Reader was created, excuse me, more than 20 years ago, it was essentially a book sharing program that used childcare centers as a distribution mechanism. And when all the childcare centers and then school classrooms shut down, our kids and families were like, where do I get my book bag? How do I swap it? And I was thinking as Ralph was speaking, one way we support parents is we just pivoted and said, we've got to get these books and bags into families' homes. And when that child may go between families, other caregivers, they might get different food at another parent's house. They might have different clothes. But when they take their bright red book bag with them, it's sort of like, I've got the toolkit with me. Parent just needs to plug in, because this is something I do wherever I go. The laundromat, the playground, wherever I go, someone is sharing books with me all the time. And it helps if, in fact, I've got some of them right with me. And so Raising a Reader just kept saying, how do we get resources to families through the Super Summer Learning Adventure and the Family Shared Reading Program, and just to make it easy for parents to don't I've got to get to the library to get a book. Oh, I don't have time, we've got to help our parents have the tools and resources, because they want to do the right thing. And it just helps to reinforce that. And I love the laundromat's approach and the pediatrician's waiting room with Reach Out and Read. The reinforcement our families get about shared reading experiences all the time is just so fundamental.
Terrific. So we have a question from our colleague Rachel Lippman, and directed to Rashanda, but others can weigh in. Are there good, what she describes as junk playgrounds, modeled on the free play spaces in Wales and Scandinavia that you've seen are working well here in the US?
I have not seen that. I actually watched some random documentary, so I know exactly what you are talking about. But I have not seen that model here. What I have seen is a move away from bright plastic, colored playgrounds to more nature-based, what children might see in their everyday environment, opportunities to play. So that feels a little bit different from what I saw in the documentary around the junk playgrounds, but it certainly is this push toward what will children see in their environment and how do they play there. So you might see playgrounds with non-traditional things, gardens there, right? That any child who comes along might be able to dig in the dirt a little bit. What does an old tire look like that's turned into a piece of play equipment? And then certainly, how do we construct this environment so that play again is meaningful and that a parent or caregiver or an older sibling might be able to engage in that moment with the child? I think what we are used to is parents, I mean, and I'm raising my hand here, that I will sit down on the bench and I sort of scoop my little ones off. But what we're seeing in this new environment of play is that what does it feel like for a parent to be able to engage actively and intentionally, and what does it look like for that playground to be built around that engagement?
Mhm.
And I think there's some great, the fundamental power of a sandbox, right? Where a child makes things. Our sandboxes were empty here in our local playground in Washington, D.C. And the parents were like, what are we going to do? The city was very ambivalent about sand. It never stayed in the sandbox. It always migrated. So it took 24 hours to crowdfund among all the parents a load of sand delivered to the, completely funded by the parents. And I dumped a bag just the other day. It was extra from a garden project. And I just saw those kids with that sand. It's not expensive. It's not complicated, but it's endlessly creative for little ones, right? And parents love sandboxes because they occupy kids.
Yeah.
And I will admit that despite all the fact that I have now learned what streaming means, I missed that document. I missed that document. It's hard to believe I missed anything. But I did not miss the work of Math Talk. And Math Talk it's got this high touch and high tech approach. And they're doing wonderful things with technology tools. But they also doing basic things with the sidewalk in front of your home, or the sidewalk a block down the street.
Yep.
And, it may be we could call that a junk playground, but when you see kids actually getting into math concepts simply by going out to the sidewalk, there is something terribly exciting and promising about that. You don't need a big facility. We can really take the most ordinary space and make it education and learning rich space. And I've got to thank Math Talk for giving me a whole new appreciation for what could happen in the sidewalk.
Yeah, and I think that gets to Ralph. I think that gets to digital equity a little bit. Some of that great work they're doing with virtual reality and a parent being able to use their cell phone, right? Something that I think the data would show most people have, being able to use that to create space and sort of these math problems and, games, right, to your point, right outside of your own home, I think to me gets to a little bit of the digital equity and how do we make sure that everybody can access some of that sort of rich learning and play that we see in other areas. I didn't know this before digging into this, but just like food deserts, we also have play deserts. We have these places across, in most of our marginalized communities where there aren't safe, free, inviting places for kids to play. And I agree with you, Ralph. Things like Math Talk really have created that wherever you are.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from our colleague Jenny Bogoni. Much of what we are thinking about in Philadelphia is about how to connect the students who are falling further behind to additional and intentional reading instruction. So many strategies we are learning about to mitigate this learning loss in K through 3. We'll ask more of our teachers in schools, extended school days, extended school years, skilled tutoring embedded in out of school time. What are you learning about how to take care of our fragile teaching workforce as we ask them to learn even more? And have you seen impactful models for expanding tutoring at scale, given that we have no time to pilot and test models right now? Right, so this gets into one way to expand learning is to expand the workforce of folks who are dedicated to teaching. Any examples or comments on Jenny's question?
I'll go.
Ralph, are you gonna?
Yeah, Jenny's doing great work in Philadelphia. And going to the second question first, we have increasing evidence that high dosage, high impact tutoring works, and high dosage, high impact tutoring involves and includes the relational element. It's not a hit and miss. And there's fairly good evidence that it works. And the late Bob Slavin really pushed that at the very outset of the pandemic. And we're seeing substantial commitments to it from the states. What the point about our teachers is worth acknowledging. You know, teachers deserve enormous amount of grace because not many professions have had to reinvent itself in plain view, where all of the mistakes were observable by everyone. And we saw the teaching profession and individual teachers do that with courage and tenacity. And while it wasn't always done well, the spirit and kindness and effort and success really are deserving of our appreciation. And we also have to acknowledge that the continuing pressure has led to pressures on the profession itself and to the teacher shortage. And we're going to have to find creative ways to address that. And